Greetings! I'm in the 41st year. Linda and I are in the 41st year of our ministry. And it's interesting, when I began first attending God's appointed times as a Christian, the first festival that I attended coming out of the yeshiva world and into the world of Christianity, first festival that I attended was the festival of Pentecost. And a minister got up and said, some of you could be aren't making enough progress because you haven't been baptized. And I was thinking, hey, you have a point there. So on June 23rd of 1968 in Emerson, New Jersey, I was baptized. And then on the 6th of Sivan, the evening that began the 6th of Sivan, which was June 5th, 1984, I was ordained into the ministry. And the first sermon I got to give as an ordained minister was also on Pentecost. And in keeping with the spirit of Pentecost, the sermon was in Spanish. I had the title of preaching elder, or anciano predicador. Now, even an anciano predicador can make mistakes. Now, last week I was going from one part of the Bible to another, and I was focusing on Luke 18. But every once in a while, because I was also going to Matthew 19, once in a while, instead of saying Luke 18, I would say Luke 19. So I hope I didn't confuse anybody. If so, I apologize. Today I want to talk about a righteous romance. You know, I'm speaking on the Sabbath before the festival of Pentecost, and Pentecost, of course, the focus is on God's church, and God's church is pictured as the bride of Christ. And today I want to talk about a righteous romance. And two wonderful people came together, and of course, it was, well, you might say, a match made in heaven. We do see God's hand in the match. And one of the wonderful people who got together was a man named Boaz. He was a very wonderful man. But before he met the daughter-in-law of Naomi, before Boaz met the daughter-in-law of Naomi, he was ruthless. Hope you like that. I'd like to go to the genealogy of the legal genealogy of Jesus Christ in Matthew, and this is the legal. His legal dad, physically speaking, was Joseph. This is the genealogy through Joseph, but it works the same with Mary in these early names. So here we see the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, and there's only 4 women in this genealogy, but notice who they are. The first case there is Tamar, and that's a very colorful account if you want to read it. And then if you go further, the next one is Rahab. Salmon, and I'm in verse 5, begat Boaz by Rahab. And Rahab, you might say, had an interesting background. You could read about that in the book of Joshua. And then we have, if you jump ahead, look at what it says about David. And Jesse, I'm in verse 6. And Jesse begot David the king. David the king begot Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. Not even mentioned by name, but the messy background is mentioned. So history is messy. All of these women who are in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, our Savior, you could say it's less than an ideal situation, you might say, in many ways. And I want to now jump into the third name, and I want to go back to verse 5. Salmon begat Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth, and Obed begot Jesse. Now Ruth is also controversial because she was a Moabitess. And if you look at Deuteronomy 25, Moabites weren't to come into the congregation of God, the assembly of God. However, if you read the word closely, you could apply it to men, And so the idea would be that females could come in because their husband would be an Israelite, and in a biblical marriage, the husband does take the lead. In a biblical marriage, the husband takes the lead. So I have just made that statement, which is on biblical authority, and I thank God that I live in a country that has a Bill of Rights that allows me to make that statement. I want to go now to Ephesians, the 5th chapter, and verse 32. Paul talks about marriage. I, of course, when I marry a couple, instruct them in Ephesians 5, among other things I tell them about, as I counsel a couple who to be married. But I want to go to verse 32, where we see the spiritual point. Ephesians 5:32. Here Paul summarizes what he's talking about in this letter to the church at Ephesus. And he says, "Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself." That's a tall order. Husbands, do it. "Nevertheless, let each of you in particular so love his own wife as himself. And let the wife see that she respects her husband." But before he made that statement, he gives really the spiritual lesson here, what he's really driving at ultimately. "This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church." So the marriage relationship is a type of the relationship between the church and Jesus Christ. So when we read about particular marriages in the Bible, when biblical heroes marry, we also should look in terms of how this particular marriage foreshadows the marriage of Christ and the church. And we certainly have that case, that situation in the Book of Ruth. We have certainly a model there of a marriage that foreshadows the relationship of Jesus Christ and the church. And the Book of Ruth is one of the 5 festival scrolls, one of the 5 Megillot, and it is customarily read on the festival of Shavuot, on the Feast of Weeks, Chag HaBikurim, the first festival of first fruits, Chag HaBikurim, because that's when the first fruits are completed. The first fruits of the barley harvest are harvested during the days of unleavened bread. Then we have Pentecost, where we during the days of unleavened bread, we would have theoretically brought the offering of the omer, the wave sheaf from the barley harvest. And then during Pentecost, we lift up the first fruits of the wheat harvest. So we have now completed the first harvests, the grain harvest. So Pentecost in the Bible is called Chag HaBikurim, the festival of first fruits. It's also called Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, and Pentecost in Greek, in Americanized Greek, the 50th day, because you have 7 weeks and then the 50th day being Pentecost. And on Pentecost, it's traditional to read the Book of Ruth. There are various reasons for that. If you read about Pentecost in Leviticus 23, you'll see a principle that is repeated in Deuteronomy, but you first find it in Leviticus 23, and you find it right after the discussion on Pentecost. So here I see in my Bible it says the Feast of Weeks, and you can read about it. And then once you read about the Feast of Weeks, then you go to verse 23 immediately following. And it says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field when you reap, nor shall you gather any gleaning from your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the stranger. I am the eternal your God. I am the Lord your God." So it's important not to just take every last bit, but, if something drops or, if there's a little bit left over, then, of course, that's for those who are in need. And because Boaz practiced this principle, he wound up together with Ruth. He was obeying what we see in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. Ruth was taking advantage of the situation, and God was taking advantage of the situation, bringing them together. I want to go now to the Book of Ruth and mention also that the Book of Ruth gives us the ancestors, of King David, and therefore of the Messiah, the Christ. And oh, that's right. In your translation, in a Hebrew Bible, Ruth would come in the third section, but I'm in a New King James, so Ruth is back here. So anyway, but the point I wanted to bring out is that Ruth and Boaz were were in the genealogy of David, and therefore in the genealogy of the Messiah, the Christ. And the Jewish tradition is that David died on Pentecost. And if you read Peter's sermon on Pentecost, which I imagine many of you are going to read on Pentecost, in this case, in 2024, I'm speaking the day before. Those of you who will be reading Peter's sermon on Pentecost will notice he refers to the death of David on that day. And as I said, the Jewish tradition is that David died on Pentecost. Anyway, you'll also see the grain harvest mentioned in the Book of Ruth as we read it. And now I'm not going to read all of it, but let's go to the Book of Ruth. When you see the Book of Ruth, you find it's designed. There's a tremendous pattern to the way it's put together. And I will mention this, that the names of all the characters can be interpreted as having a relevance to their part in the account. And that's how that worked. God worked that out. Anyway, so that's maybe a subject I can cover at another time. So here we have the Book of Ruth, and in the first chapter we have the introduction of the story of the account. What happened here? There was a famine in Judah, so a family moved to Moab, and now the Moabites were not a friendly people to the Jews, but but at this time, evidently there was food in Moab, and there was a lack of food in Judah, so a family moved there, and a woman and her sons, stayed there long enough to marry there, and of course she moved there with her husband. In other words, a couple moved there with their sons. So a family of 4 moved there, husband, wife, and 2 sons. The husband died, but the sons married, but then they died. So here is a widow, and her 2 daughters-in-law are also widowed, and that's the situation. So she found out that things are working out well now in Judah, so she realized it was now time to go back. And of course, when they left, they would have sold their property. And in the Bible, the tribal inheritances were very important. It was very important to carry on the family name and the family inheritance and the tribal identity. This is the Holy Land. So in Leviticus 25, there's the Jubilee year. But besides the Jubilee year, we also have the right of a family to redeem land that has been sold. In other words, a relative can come along and is entitled to buy back that land. He is the Goel. He's the kinsman redeemer. And he can do that. And we also have a principle in Deuteronomy 25 of what is called levirate marriage. In other words, a man has a right, in a sense, to determine to some degree the DNA of his offspring, even posthumously. If the brother dies, then his inheritance is not going to be lost, because his brother will then marry the widow, and the son that comes from that union will inherit the dead father's land. Will have his name, his inheritance. So the inheritance remains with that man. And not only that, but also his brother has married his widow, so the son is to some degree, carrying on that family background that the dead husband would have given, if you follow what I'm saying. So you had that principle of levirate marriage in the Bible. Of course, that comes up in an interesting passage in the Synoptic Gospels. Jesus dealt with the question at the time that the Sadducees were asking him. That's, of course, a subject for another day. So anyway, this is some background and some of the technicalities that come up in the Book of Ruth. And we come to the end of that first chapter. We see that one of the daughters-in-law finally does decide to stay home because Naomi insists, stay home, don't come with me. That's not the thing to do. But Ruth insisted. So here we see Ruth accepting upon herself the Sinaitic covenant. She wants to join with Naomi. She wants to join with the people of Judah. She wants to become, as I said, come under the Sinaitic covenant. And this is foreshadowing the conversion of the Gentiles. In Acts 10, we see that, of course, God intended the new covenant to apply to the whole human race. And he is going to see to it that most people are included in it. God's plan is going to work out as he intends. He's omnipotent. Now, he has given us free will. So not everybody is going to is going to be there, because they may decide to opt out, and then they will be dead forever. They're extinct. They're ashes. They're burned up finally in their ashes. But most people will wind up ultimately in a new covenant relationship with God. He has it all worked out. And Ruth is a foreshadowing of that. So anyway, we go to verse 16, the famous passage. But Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." What a definite statement. What a commitment. And that's the kind of commitment we make, when we're baptized. And so obviously Naomi realized, I'm not going to turn her away, so okay, come on with me. And back we go to Bethlehem, to the house of bread, where Jesus Christ was born later on, at the city of David. I was going to mention that in Proverbs 31, we see the virtuous woman, but the Hebrew is Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor. We see this model woman, this model wife, the Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor. And she is a type of the church. We have the fallen woman in Proverbs, who's a type of false religious systems. And then we have the virtuous woman, who is a type of the church. And we see that same term is applied to Ruth. Boaz applies that term Eshet Chayil to Ruth. She is a woman of valor. And so they come back to Bethlehem, and we go now to the second chapter, where Ruth takes advantage of the fact that she can glean, she can get what's left behind at the harvest. But Boaz noticed her, and Boaz was quite impressed with her. And so I'm going to go to verse. Let's go to well, I don't want to go. I don't only have so much time I want to devote to this. You should read the whole Book of Ruth if you haven't in a while. This is a good time to read it. As I said, the rabbinical Pentecost was on the 6th of Sivan, so just recently that book was being read all around the world by Orthodox Jews. Anyway, so now Boaz said to her at mealtime, I'm in verse 14, pardon me, "Come here and eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she ate, and she was satisfied, and kept some back. She was concerned with her mother-in-law. And then she rose up to glean. When she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. Also let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it, and that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." And so she brought quite a bit of barley back to her mother-in-law, and then her mother-in-law realized, wow, this wonderful, generous man is a relative. And so she realized that this could work out really well for Ruth. Boaz was a lot older than Ruth, and one wonders why he was still single. perhaps he had married, but his wife had gone childless and was now dead. It's possible. Anyway, so in verse 20 of that chapter 2, then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead." And Naomi said to her, "This man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives." Now, if you go to the book of Job, the 19th chapter, you see a verse there, and Job might have been referring to somebody from his family who would come along and finally settle the score, but it also is a messianic prophecy. And I want to read Job 19:25. Job, of course, is in really bad shape here, but he says, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, my Goel, my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth." So whatever he had in mind, but it's in here, but also it's a messianic prophecy, because indeed our Redeemer lives. Now our Redeemer had to come and die, but our Redeemer was then resurrected to mortal life, and our Redeemer lives. So anyway, we go back now to Boaz as the Goel, in this case the kinsman redeemer. And so Ruth the Moabitess said, "He also said to me," verse 21 of Ruth 2, "You shall stay close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest." Then Naomi said to Ruth her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, and that people do not meet you in any other field." So she stayed close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest. So that, barley harvest is around the days of unleavened bread. Then it goes on. The wheat harvest, of course, is on Pentecost. And the wheat harvest, and she dwelt with her mother-in-law. So she went to the end of the wheat harvest as well. The other day, one of these messages recently, I was talking about the 15th of the 5th month during the grape harvest, which is which is a special day among Jews, a special time for weddings. Maybe the 15th of the 5th month is when this marriage occurred, because it occurred after these grain harvests. Anyway, we're not there at the marriage yet. We're now there at the beginning stage. Boaz evidently really was fond of Ruth, frankly, but he was a bit older than she was, and maybe he didn't feel like he wanted to push the relationship for that reason. But she pushed it, obviously, when you read about it. And, her mother told her to do it, because her mother knew what kind of man Boaz was. And her mother told her, you go ahead and make the first move, and he'll take it from there. By the way, that often happens in a relationship. The woman makes a kind of subtle first move, and then if the man is any kind of man, he'll then take the ball and run with it, as it were. Anyway, then he said, "Who are you?" So she answered, "I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative." So now he knew that the door was opened, and so he didn't need any more encouragement than that. Then he said, "Blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you." So he was a good bit older than she was. For you have shown your kindness at the end, more kindness at the end than at the beginning, and that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich. And so he without going further into it, I think it's in this chapter where he calls her a woman of valor. But in any case, he did give her that title. Then, of course, she left and went back to her mother-in-law with all this, barley that he'd given her. And now we come to the 4th chapter, and there is a closer relative who could theoretically, redeem the land, and as part of the redemption, theoretically could marry Ruth, so that now the family could retain, the immediate family, the husband of Ruth could retain the land. There was a closer relative, so Boaz had to first deal with that. And so if we go to verse 5, there was a closer relative who was willing to buy the land, but evidently there was also at this point the principle had developed, using the principle of levirate marriage in Deuteronomy. The established tradition at the time was that if in fact you could marry the widow, so that the land remains in her husband's name. And so then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth, the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, so to perpetuate the name of the dead through the inheritance. And the close relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. So now the formal arrangement was made. There were the witnesses there. The appropriate actions were taken, and now Boaz marries, buys the land and marries Ruth. Now, what did he mean he would ruin his own inheritance? There's speculation on that. It's possible that he had other children by a marriage. I don't know if he had a living wife, but he had living children, and I think he feared that if he married Ruth, the first son would inherit Ruth's dead husband's land. But what if there were then other children? Then he would have to distribute land among his children plus these other ones. So maybe that was the problem. People speculate as to what the problem was, but in any case, it kept him from wanting to go through with it. So now Boaz marries Ruth, and as I said, he could have questioned the fact that she was a Moabitess, but she obviously was such a wonderful person. She had obviously committed herself to the Sinaitic covenant, and so Boaz evidently was quite sure that this was the right thing to do, which we see that it was. And it's interesting, if you go back to the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah, you see the prophecies, the blessings that were recited at that marriage. That was a very special marriage, obviously, the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah. And so was this particular marriage. So you also see prophecies regarding this marriage. Verse 11, so Boaz marries Ruth, and all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel, and may you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. This is a Hebrew parallelism, the Hebrew poetry where you say something and you say it again in another way, to make the point. And may you prosper in Bethlehem and be famous in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. So it adds a bit. It repeats it, but yet it also adds a bit to it as well. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman. And a very special marriage of Boaz and Ruth. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And let me say that this relationship was a foreshadowing of the relationship of Jesus Christ and the church. Boaz was the Goel, the kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer had the right to redeem the land, but he had to want to do it. Boaz wanted to do it. The kinsman redeemer had to buy the land. Jesus Christ voluntarily sacrificed himself because we had lost the kingdom of God. Our ancestors were sinners. All of us are sinners. Jesus Christ has redeemed for us our inheritance in the kingdom of God. He did so willingly, and he paid for it with his betrayal, arrest, and torture, and his blood and his flesh and his death. He paid for it with in effect with all that he went through, with his sacrifice. He also marries ultimately the church. He is committed. He's betrothed now to the church. So he was willing to do it. He paid for it. He married the church. And there will be offspring who will inherit the kingdom of God. As Jesus Christ marries the church in the millennium, that marriage will lead to millions and ultimately billions of sons and daughters of God. And so it's just a wonderful, this marriage is a wonderful type of the relationship of Christ and the church. Moreover, we see here a descendant of Judah marrying a Moabitess. So we see also the prophecy that the Gentiles would ultimately be grafted into the covenant people. So we have the new covenant, which is, it begins with Judah and Israel, but it spreads to the whole world. So we come to the conclusion of Ruth. Now this is the genealogy of Perez. Perez begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram, and Ram begat Aminadab. Aminadab begat Nachshon. Nachshon begot Salmon. Salmon begat Boaz, and Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. And then from David, of course, we understand that the promise God made, like he made a covenant with David, that from David's seed would come ultimately the Messiah. And this Messiah also, when we understand the Bible clearly, it's more than Messiah, he's also Savior. And I want to conclude by going to Revelation 19. So, for those of you who are going to be keeping Pentecost the day after I give this message, Chag Sameach to you. And for those of you who hear this message on the Sabbath, Shabbat Shalom to you. But I hope and pray this message will be edifying whenever you hear it. Whenever you hear it. Let's go to Revelation 19 and verse 7. Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready. That's the responsibility of the ministry now, to prepare the bride of Christ, to have this character that is mentioned here. And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Then he said to me, Write, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, These are the true sayings of God. All the best to you and yours.